Digital Deception. Unmasking the Truth, Chapter 1. The calm before the storm. I once believed I was living the perfect life, or at least the kind of life I'd always hoped for. Stable, filled with small, daily comforts and a loving partner by my side. Alex and I had been together for 7 years, and our lives seemed to fit together seamlessly. We had our routine, mornings with freshly brewed coffee, evening walks, and quiet weekends where we'd talk about our dreams for the future. I loved that rhythm, the simplicity of being close to someone, sharing everything from errands to whispered jokes. He'd leave for work early, give me a quick kiss, and I'd watch him drive away, always feeling grateful to have him. Yet, as much as I thought I knew him, looking back, there were small cracks. Little things that seemed innocent at the time. A new cologne he started wearing, texts late at night that he'd brush off as work-related. But I trusted him. What would make a loving husband, a man who vowed to be by my side, do something so cruel, so deceptive, that it would shatter the trust we'd spent years building? It's that question that would start to haunt me, pulling me down a path of discovery that I never could have anticipated. Author's note. In relationships, we often ignore warning signs, seeing only what we want to see. The question is, what do we do when we realize that the person closest to us has betrayed our trust in ways we never imagined? Chapter 2. A whisper of doubt. For a moment, I froze, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down, squeezing the air from my lungs. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but that single line burned into my mind, mocking the trust one had given him so freely. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Each word was like a tiny dagger, twisting deeper with every second. My fingers hovered over his phone, a war raging inside me. Should I go further, read the message, or just walk away? I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, but I couldn't resist. I opened the phone. The messages between them were laid out like evidence on a cold, sterile table, a history of moments I hadn't known existed. I felt sick reading their inside jokes, the plans they'd made, the pet names. My mind reeled, each word driving a deeper wedge between the life I thought I had and this ugly, undeniable reality. When I heard the shower turn off, I quickly locked the phone, placing it back as if nothing had happened. I barely made it to the kitchen before he walked in, smiling as though everything was fine. The sight of him filled me with a mix of anger and sorrow so intense it was hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but instead, I found myself quietly finishing dinner, each word exchanged between us feeling more hollow than the last. Over the next few days, I lived in a daze, forcing myself to smile, to play the part of the oblivious wife, even as my heart ached with every thought. Questions haunted me. Who was I to him? How long had he been lying? Each answer felt like a step toward a breaking point I wasn't ready to face. Author's note. Sometimes, the smallest clue can unravel everything we believed in. Suspicion is a quiet poison that seeps into our minds, often when we least expect it. Chapter 3. The search for truth. I sat there, numb, staring at the phone in my hand as if it were a ticking bomb. The life I'd built with Alex, all the memories, the promises, everything felt tainted, twisted into something ugly and hollow. Rage simmered beneath my shock, a heat that began to thaw the numbness and fill me with an unfamiliar strength. I wasn't going to be the wounded, betrayed wife. No, he'd underestimated me, and that would be his mistake. The first step was gathering evidence, something solid that would prove, without question, what he'd done. I opened his email next, finding confirmations for hotels, reservations at fancy restaurants, and receipts for gifts I'd never seen. He was careless, as if he'd believed I'd never question him, never dig beneath the surface of his lies. Each new discovery was like another piece of a puzzle I hadn't asked to solve, and with every clue, I felt myself changing, my heartbreak hardening into a steely resolve. Days turned into weeks, and I continued my quiet investigation, noting his routines, cataloging his excuses. I became an observer in my own life, watching him go through the motions while I documented his deceit, compiling evidence like I would for a case at work. He had no idea I knew, and I took a strange, fierce satisfaction in my silence, in my hidden knowledge. I felt like I was reclaiming a bit of the power he'd stolen with each lie he told. The plan began to take shape in my mind, slowly, deliberately. It wouldn't be dramatic. There would be no tears, no shouting. I would make him feel the betrayal as deeply as I did, through the very life he took for granted, his polished facade crumbling piece by piece. Author's note: there's a strange strength that comes when we uncover a painful truth. It's like a second heartbeat, keeping us going when everything else feels shattered. Chapter 4. Hidden in plain sight each day, I played my part perfectly, masking every flicker of pain behind a calm smile, nodding along as he recited his usual excuses. I'd watch him head out the door with his polished suit and charming grin, supposedly off to another late meeting. And every time he did, I'd make a note, adding to my growing ledger of his lies. The mornings after these nights were almost eerie. The way he'd kiss my forehead, pour me coffee, and pretend that nothing had changed. It was as if he believed his act so fully, he never imagined that I, too, could put on a show. I became meticulous, cataloging his digital trail with an intensity I'd usually reserve for high-stakes cases at work. There was a strange satisfaction in gathering the evidence, a feeling that I was building my own fortress, brick by brick. I accessed his social media accounts, scouring for clues in tagged photos and hidden messages, unearthing the private world he'd thought he could keep hidden. Each discovery, each new lie, fueled a determination that had me working late into the night, combing through his phone and accounts with a sharpened purpose. I wasn't just watching, I was hunting. He started to notice my distance, asking if something was wrong, if I was tired. "Just work stress," I'd reply, giving him a reassuring smile that I'd perfected for this very moment. He'd nod, relieved, and go back to his routine, oblivious to the storm building under his own roof. The irony wasn't lost on me. For the first time, I was the one with the secrets, and unlike him, I knew the full weight of what I was hiding. The plan formed in my mind, crystallizing with every passing day. It wasn't enough to simply confront him. I wanted him to feel the betrayal as I had, to watch his carefully curated life unravel before him. But this wouldn't be an angry, reckless revenge. I wanted it to be cold, calculated, delivered with a precision that would make him understand just how deeply he had underestimated me. I would wait for the perfect moment, bide my time, and then let the truth unfold in a way he would never forget. Author's note: sometimes, staying silent is the most powerful move we can make. Knowledge, after all, is a weapon, especially when it's wielded by someone who's been hurt deeply. Chapter 5. A plan for revenge. The first post was simple, just enough to spark curiosity. A photo of Alex and Kimberly at dinner, her hand resting on his arm. I captioned it, "When business trips turn personal." It didn't take long before the comments started rolling in. Some in disbelief, others asking questions, hinting at a truth that was finally being brought to light. I watched as his family and friends reacted, many of them stunned, a few even reaching out to me privately. I kept my responses vague, letting them come to their own conclusions. The truth, after all, was plain to see. Next, I posted a screenshot of one of their more intimate text exchanges, dated on a weekend he'd claimed to be out of town for work. The comments turned from curiosity to shock, anger, even pity. Alex, of course, had no idea. He was blissfully unaware as he went about his day, not yet realizing that his carefully constructed world was about to fall apart. Each post was like a small release of pressure, a step toward reclaiming the dignity he had stripped from me. When I thought of all the times I'd sat alone at our dinner table, wondering why he'd become so distant, I felt vindicated knowing that he'd soon have to explain his actions not just to me, but to everyone who had thought they knew him. For once, he would feel the sting of judgment, the burning humiliation of being laid bare. The final post came the following morning, scheduled to go live just as he would be logging into his accounts to discover the mess. It was a picture of Kimberly and Alex, tagged in some vacation destination I'd never heard of. The caption read, "Hope the lies were worth it." I could almost see him scrambling to delete everything, to stop the tidal wave of consequences, but it was too late. The posts had been shared, saved, screenshotted, passed along like wildfire. And then came the messages, the frantic calls from him, all of which I ignored. My phone buzzed incessantly with his desperate apologies, his weak justifications. I read each one with a detached satisfaction. He was unraveling, powerless, and for the first time, he knew what it was like to feel the helplessness I'd lived with for so long. Friends reached out too, asking what had happened, if I was okay. Some expressed outrage on my behalf, others voiced disappointment. I responded only when I wanted to, careful not to let anything break my calm. But there was one final piece to my plan. I knew he kept a separate bank account, one he'd tried to hide from me under the guise of savings. It was, in reality, the account he'd been using to fund his time with her, the dinners, the gifts, the hotels. Accessing it was easy. In a few clicks, I transferred every cent to a charity that supported women escaping toxic relationships. As I watched the balance drop to zero, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any I'd known. It was like drawing a final line, cutting off the last thread that had tied us together. As the dust settled, I felt an unfamiliar peace, a calm that came from knowing I'd reclaimed a part of myself. My revenge wasn't just about hurting him. It was about showing him and everyone else that I was not a woman to be betrayed and dismissed. I'd taken back the power he'd stolen, and in doing so, I'd freed myself. Author's note: there's something eerily satisfying in taking back control. When betrayal breaks us, revenge can sometimes put us back together, at least for a little while. Chapter 6. The fallout. He stumbled around, trying to come up with excuses, his face going pale as he realized just how exposed he was. His hands trembled as he held his phone, desperately trying to type out responses to friends, family, and co-workers who were now aware of his double life. I watched silently, arms crossed, leaning against the kitchen counter as his world imploded. I almost wanted to laugh at his helplessness, the way he flailed, grasping for control that was no longer his. He finally looked up at me, eyes wild with a mix of panic and anger. "Did you do this?" he asked, his voice low and strained, as if he couldn't fully believe it. I met his gaze without a flicker of emotion. "What does it matter?" I replied, my voice steady. "The truth's out now." The realization washed over him, his shoulders sagging as he took in the full scope of what he had lost. Our life together, the image he had so carefully maintained, the respect of his colleagues. It was all slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He tried to say something, anything to justify his actions, but the words fell flat. There was no excuse, no apology that could erase what he had done, and he knew it. I felt a twisted sense of justice watching him crumble. This was the weight he had forced me to carry in silence, the sleepless nights I'd spent wondering what was wrong, the heartache of every lie he'd told. Now, he was the one haunted by his own decisions, and there was something deeply satisfying in that reversal. After a while, he stopped pleading and sat on the edge of the couch, head in his hands, defeated. The silence that followed was thick, filled with the understanding that things would never return to the way they had been. Our marriage, our home, everything we had built was gone, but strangely, I felt lighter. When he finally left the room, I stayed behind. Standing alone in the kitchen, taking it all in, the house felt quieter than it ever had, almost hollow. But within that emptiness was a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. My mind was clear, and the tension that had gripped my heart for so long had loosened, replaced by a quiet strength. As I packed a bag later that night, I felt no regret, no second thoughts. I left a note for him on the counter, a simple goodbye, letting him know that he'd be hearing from my lawyer soon. I walked out the door without looking back, stepping into a new life, one where I was finally free from his lies, from the doubt and betrayal. The next morning, I woke up in a small rented apartment, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the blinds. I felt exhausted but strangely at peace. It wasn't happiness yet, but it was a beginning. I had been through the worst, and somehow, I knew that I could rebuild, that the real story of my life could now truly begin. Author's note: revenge doesn't heal, but it can give us a sense of justice, a feeling that the wrongs done to us are not left unchecked. Chapter 7. Financial ruin. After hitting transfer, I leaned back, staring at the empty balance on his screen, feeling a sense of satisfaction that went beyond anger. This money, the same funds he'd used to woo her, pay for their dates, and hide their affair, would now be used for something meaningful. It was almost poetic, turning his lies and betrayal into support for those who needed it most. I could picture him checking his account later, scrambling to understand how everything he'd stashed away had vanished in an instant. It was my final move in a game I never asked to play, yet one that he had started the moment he lied to me. For months, I'd felt like an outsider in my own life, watching helplessly as the man I trusted drifted further away. But now, I had taken back control, piece by piece. As I sat in our quiet living room, I looked around, letting the reality sink in that this life, this home, was no longer ours. It was mine, reclaimed in a way that only I could understand. I knew the devastation this would bring him, the money, the reputation, the double life he'd cultivated. All of it unraveled. I felt a strange calm settling over me, almost as if I'd just exhaled months of held breath. This wasn't just revenge, it was closure. And as I sat there, I realized that I had given myself the kind of freedom he could never take away again. Hours passed before he returned. The moment he walked in, I could tell he already knew. He looked at me, eyes wide with disbelief, the color drained from his face. I stayed silent, watching as he pulled out his phone, desperately tapping and swiping, realizing that his money was gone, his social media was exposed, his entire life shattered in one evening. "You did this," he finally whispered, voice thick with shock. "Yes," I replied simply, meeting his gaze without a hint of remorse. "And now, you'll feel what it's like to lose everything." He looked at me, defeated, unable to process the magnitude of what had happened. For the first time, he was the one at a loss for words, the one fumbling to understand the reality I'd set in motion. It was a moment of bitter satisfaction, a reversal of every lie, every excuse, every act of deceit he'd tried to bury. I wanted him to carry this weight, to understand that betrayal doesn't just go unanswered. After he stormed out, I found myself standing alone in the house, a quiet serenity settling over me. This was the beginning of something new, a clean slate I had given myself. I packed a bag that night, locking up the life we'd shared and stepping away from the ruins. And as I closed the door for the last time, I knew I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I had my strength, my dignity, and the promise of a life I could now live on my terms. Author's note: sometimes, our best revenge is to turn something harmful into something good. For every hurt we feel, there's a way to transform it into hope for someone else. Chapter 8. Confrontation. He reached out, as if trying to pull me back, his voice desperate, cracking with each word. "Please, you don't understand. It was just a phase. I was stressed. It didn't mean anything. Please, don't do this." But his pleas felt hollow, like echoes in a space I no longer occupied. For so long, I'd imagined this moment, bracing for the tears, the rage, the sorrow I'd expected to feel. Yet, standing there, watching his desperation, I felt only a calm, resolute distance. I was already miles away from the life we had shared. His face, once so familiar and comforting, now looked different, a stranger's, hollowed by the realization that his lies had unraveled. "I've already done it, Alex," I said, holding his gaze. "Everything you valued more than me, the image, the money, the perfect life, is gone. And now you have to live with what you've done." The impact of my words struck him visibly. He looked shattered, like he couldn't fathom the full extent of what he had lost until this very moment. "But we can rebuild. I'll prove it to you. I'll be the man you need me to be," he muttered, each sentence sounding weaker than the last. The irony was almost laughable. He was grasping at promises, desperate to rewind time, to pull me back into his carefully constructed world. But I was done playing my part. "No," I replied softly but firmly. "You've shown me exactly who you are. I was just too blind to see it before. But I'm not anymore." There was nothing more to say, and I could feel the weight lifting with each word, each step I took toward the door. As I reached the threshold, he took a step toward me, panic flaring in his eyes. "Please, don't go. Let me explain." Let me make it right. There was a flicker of the man I once loved, his vulnerability laid bare. But it was too late. His sincerity felt misplaced. Too little, too late. A desperate attempt to salvage something he'd recklessly discarded. With a final, resolute look, I turned the doorknob. Goodbye, Alex. And then, I walked out, closing the chapter of us for good. As the door shut behind me, a strange sense of finality settled over me, as though a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was free. Outside, the cool night air washed over me, filling me with an unexpected calm. I walked down the path, my mind swirling with fragments of our past, but they felt distant, like memories from another lifetime. The street was quiet, empty, as if the world itself was giving me a clean slate. I felt the beginnings of something that felt almost like hope, a chance to start anew. The first night in my new apartment, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the absence of the life I'd left behind. It wasn't quite happiness yet, but it was relief. The realization that I was no longer waiting for answers, no longer carrying the weight of his lies, allowed me to exhale fully for the first time in months. I was alone, but I was no longer lonely. Over the next few days, I began picking up the pieces, creating new routines that were mine and mine alone. I'd wake early, go for walks around the neighborhood, finding peace in the small things I'd once overlooked, the early light filtering through the trees, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the quiet calm that came from knowing I was free from his shadow. Each day brought a small victory, a reminder that I was reclaiming my life on my own terms. Alex tried to reach out a few times. Texts, voicemails, apologies that became angrier as it dawned on him that I wasn't coming back. I read them, one by one, more out of curiosity than anything else, until one day, I simply stopped. His words held no power over me anymore. I had already begun to leave him behind. Weeks turned into months, and gradually, I started to feel whole again. I began rediscovering pieces of myself that had been buried in the routine of our marriage, small passions I'd abandoned, like painting, writing, even cooking elaborate meals just for myself. Friends reached out, and I let them back in, surrounding myself with people who truly cared. There were still moments when I'd feel the sting of betrayal, the memories of what he'd done, but those moments grew smaller, like fading bruises. I had reclaimed my life, rebuilt it from the ashes of his deceit, and every step forward felt like a declaration of strength. Looking back, I don't regret the way I left, or the revenge that took back what he had taken from me. It wasn't just for him. It was for me, a way of ensuring that I would never settle for anything less than the truth, never be held back by someone else's lies. I had walked away from that old life, and I knew that I'd never have to look back. Author's note: facing those who've wronged us gives closure, but it also tests our strength. True closure, though, comes when we walk away for good. Chapter 9. The escape. My new apartment was tiny, with just enough space for a bed, a small sofa, and a makeshift desk by the window where I could sit and watch the world go by. It felt foreign at first, to be alone in this way, stripped of the familiar comforts that had once defined my life. In those first quiet mornings, I would make myself a single cup of coffee, missing the sounds of another person in the house, and wonder if I'd overreacted, if I'd let my pain cloud my judgment. But as the days passed, I noticed a quiet calm settling over me, like the pieces of myself were slowly reassembling. Each day brought a tiny step forward. I began exploring the neighborhood, finding small joys in simple things. An inviting bakery on the corner, a park where I'd sit and read, a coffee shop with a quirky barista who always had a joke ready. I could feel myself letting go of the bitterness, leaving behind the constant questioning, the need to check my phone or look over my shoulder. Here, no one knew me as his wife. I was just myself. Some nights were harder than others. There were moments when memories of Alex crept back in, flashes of the good times, echoes of his laughter, the warmth of his hand in mine. Those moments would bring a pang of sadness, a quiet ache reminding me of the life we'd once shared. But I learned to accept those memories, to let them come and go without holding on to them. I was no longer the woman waiting for his affection, no longer haunted by the lies he'd left in our marriage. Slowly, those memories lost their hold over me, like waves that grew softer each time they washed ashore. One night, feeling particularly brave, I unpacked an old canvas and set it on the desk. Painting had once been my way of finding peace, but I'd given it up, busy with the routines of our life together. Now, alone in my quiet space, I let myself paint for hours. Colors flowed from my brush, blues, greens, warm golds, all blending together into something that felt uniquely mine. I lost myself in the act, feeling like I was reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. As the months passed, I began forming new connections, friendships that felt real and unburdened by my past. There was Sophie, my downstairs neighbor who'd invite me over for tea and share stories of her travels, and Mark, the friendly owner of the bookstore who always slipped me recommendations based on whatever book I'd just returned. These new people became my community, each of them filling my life with warmth and humor I hadn't felt in so long. Alex still tried to reach out, sending messages and emails, leaving voicemails that fluctuated between pleading and anger. I would listen at first, more out of curiosity than anything else, but eventually, I stopped. His words meant nothing to me now, like faded echoes from a life that no longer belonged to me. I was free, and I wanted to focus on building something new, unclouded by the betrayals of the past. In time, I found myself waking up genuinely content, no longer defined by his betrayal or my revenge. I was just me. I started a small freelance project, designing websites for local businesses, and threw myself into it, enjoying the independence and the sense of accomplishment that came with each new project. For the first time, I was building a life that was entirely my own, one I didn't have to share with anyone. One evening, as the sun set outside my window, casting a warm glow over the walls of my apartment, I sat with a glass of wine and realized how far I had come. I wasn't the woman left behind, nor the woman seeking retribution. I was simply a woman who had reclaimed herself piece by piece. It had taken time, tears, and a journey through pain and anger, but I had found my way through it all, stronger and more resilient. I could still feel traces of the old wounds, but they no longer hurt. They had faded, leaving behind a quiet wisdom, a reminder of how much I'd endured and how much I had grown. I had learned to embrace the quiet, to trust myself, to let go of the need for validation or closure from someone else. And as I looked out at the lights of my new town, I knew that I had truly found a fresh start, one that was mine alone. Author's note: starting over is painful, but sometimes it's the only way to truly heal. There's strength in choosing yourself over the people who hurt you. Chapter 10. Rediscovering joy. Each morning, I'd wake up to the soft glow of the sun filtering through the blinds, filling the room with warmth. My little apartment, with its mismatched furniture and paint-splattered floors, had become a sanctuary, a place that reflected the person I was becoming, someone who was finally free, unburdened by secrets and deceptions. I spent hours with a paintbrush in hand, letting my emotions flow onto the canvas. The vibrant colors, messy and uncontrolled, felt like a release of everything I'd held inside. For the first time in years, I felt like I was creating something just for me. My friends were a constant joy. They were different from the people Alex and I used to know, unpretentious and kind, people who valued sincerity over appearances. There was Clara, a fellow artist I'd met in a local gallery, who'd become my creative confidant. She'd come over with wine and talk about her own journey of self-discovery, encouraging me to keep painting, to pour my feelings into my work. Then there was Sam, a neighbor who lived down the hall, always showing up with a smile and an offer to fix anything around my apartment that needed fixing. He had a quiet warmth that made me feel safe and accepted for exactly who I was. Little by little, I rebuilt myself from the pieces Alex had left behind. I laughed easily, something I hadn't done in years, and found myself becoming a woman I'd long forgotten. A woman who wasn't afraid to take up space, to speak her mind, to love fiercely but carefully. I no longer felt like I had to please anyone or shape myself to fit someone else's expectations. Instead, I lived by my own rules, and with every passing day, I became more comfortable in my own skin. One evening, Clara invited me to a small art exhibition where local artists were showcasing their work. "You should submit one of your pieces," she suggested, eyes bright with excitement. I laughed it off, too shy to imagine my work on display, but after some encouragement, I picked one of my favorite pieces, a vibrant, abstract canvas that felt like a snapshot of my journey. Standing in that gallery, watching people admire my work, I felt a surge of pride. It was a turning point, a moment when I realized I was no longer just surviving. I was thriving. The memories of Alex and the life we'd shared no longer stung. They were like faint shadows, reminders of lessons learned. Occasionally, I'd catch myself wondering how he was, if he'd changed, if he'd even understood the depth of the damage he'd caused. But the curiosity was fleeting, like a brief flicker, and then it was gone. I no longer felt tied to him or defined by his betrayal. He had become a chapter one had closed, a past that no longer held power over me. Months later, as winter turned to spring, Sam asked me to join him on a weekend hike. We drove out of town, the two of us chatting easily as we wandered through winding trails and lush forests. At one point, we stopped at a clearing overlooking a valley bathed in golden sunlight. Standing there, breathing in the fresh air, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Sam smiled at me, and I realized that for the first time in so long, I wasn't haunted by the past. I was just present. In that moment, I knew I had finally reclaimed myself. My heart, once heavy with hurt, now felt light, open, ready to embrace whatever came next. It wasn't about revenge or proving anything to anyone. It was about living fully, deeply, on my own terms. The anger, the hurt, even the satisfaction of seeing Alex's world crumble, they all faded into something quieter, a knowing that I had emerged stronger, more resilient, and undeniably my own person. Returning home that evening, I looked around my apartment, filled with paintings and souvenirs from my new life, and smiled. This was my life, filled with color, joy, and possibilities I hadn't dreamed of before. The shadows of the past had finally lifted, and as I looked to the future, I felt a thrill of excitement, a sense that anything was possible. I had been broken, but I had rebuilt myself, stronger and more vibrant than ever. This was my life, and I was finally, truly free. Author's note: healing comes in stages. Finding ourselves again means letting go of who we were with others and embracing who we are on our own. Chapter 11. Reflections: the letters he sent when unopened. Each one tucked away in a drawer as a reminder of a life I had left behind. At first, it was tempting to read them, to see if his words held any truth, any genuine regret. But I resisted. I knew that even the sincerest apology couldn't undo the damage, and I had no interest in reopening wounds I'd worked so hard to heal. His calls were easy to ignore, too. I'd listen to his voicemails only to hear the desperation in his voice, a strange comfort in knowing he finally understood the weight of what he'd lost. But his regret was no longer my concern. I'd moved on to a life that didn't need his validation. In my new world, I had discovered the beauty of my own company, the strength of standing alone without looking to anyone else to make me feel complete. I took long walks, savoring the stillness, the sense of freedom that came with living fully in each moment. My happiness no longer depended on anyone but myself, and there was a deep satisfaction in that, like I'd unearthed something precious within me that had always been there, just buried beneath years of compromise and neglect. Gradually, I created a life that felt entirely mine. I filled my days with activities that brought me joy, painting and exploring new interests, even dabbling in photography, something I'd always wanted to try but had never made time for. I traveled, explored new places, met people who felt like a breath of fresh air. They saw me for who I was now, not as someone's wife or the shadow of a broken relationship. I was simply me, and that was enough. One evening, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I watched the sunset paint the sky with hues of pink and orange. I felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over me, a quiet, powerful gratitude for the strength I had found, for the peace I'd reclaimed. Alex's letters and calls were no more than whispers from another lifetime, a faint echo of the woman I had been. I had transformed that hurt into resilience, that betrayal into a chance to become someone new. And as I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, I knew I'd never need anything from him again. I had finally given myself the closure I once thought only he could offer. I was whole, complete in a way I'd never been before, and nothing. No apology, no reconciliation could add or take away from the person I had become. Author's note. Moving on means letting go, not just of others, but of the parts of ourselves that hold onto the pain. True freedom is finding peace with what was and looking forward to what can be. Chapter 12. A new beginning. My days are now filled with a quiet joy that I hadn't known was possible. There's a simplicity to my life that I cherish, a rhythm that's all my own. I wake up early, savoring the silence of the morning, brewing a cup of coffee, and feeling the warmth seep into my hands. I take time to journal, to paint, or sometimes just to sit by the window and watch the world outside, knowing that every choice I make belongs solely to me. I have dreams again, real, vibrant dreams that aren't shaped by anyone else's expectations. I'm planning to open a small art studio, a space where I can share my work with others and, hopefully, help people find their own creative voice. It's an idea that once seemed impossible, something I never would have pursued while I was tangled up in a life built around someone else's needs. But now, it feels not only possible but inevitable, as though this is where I was meant to be all along. When I look back on the person I was, the woman who doubted, who worried, who stayed silent in the face of lies, I feel compassion for her. She did the best she could with what she knew, and in a strange way, I'm grateful for her endurance. She got me here, after all, to a place where I could shed the weight of a life that wasn't really mine. I no longer feel anger when I think of Alex. Instead, I feel a distant sense of closure. What happened between us was painful, and there are still moments when a small shadow of that betrayal will cross my mind, but it fades as quickly as it comes. That chapter has closed. I no longer need an apology or a reckoning. He's part of my story, but he no longer defines it. I live each day with a newfound clarity, driven by a simple but powerful promise to myself. I will never again let someone else's choices dictate my worth or my happiness. This life, this quiet, fulfilling life, is the result of my own resilience, my own courage to start anew. And as I stand here now, gazing at the path I've walked, I know I'm ready for whatever comes next. I've learned that strength isn't just about survival. It's about growth, about transforming pain into something beautiful and empowering. I am free, not because I've forgotten the past, but because I've learned to live beyond it. So here I am, with dreams to chase, a life to create, and a heart that's finally at peace. I never would have chosen the path that brought me here, but standing in the life I've built, I wouldn't trade it for anything. I am living, truly living, and for the first time in my life, that's enough. Author's note. Life doesn't always go the way we plan, but sometimes the hardest paths lead us to the places we most need to be.